Today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Kaf Zayin. Hadron Women of Minneapolis is sponsoring the month of Kislev in memory of our Daf Yomi study partner, Monica Howell. Most in our group were connected via our shul, our neighborhood, or just from around town. Monica showed up to our first siyum pre-COVID and introduced herself to us. She was the only newcomer to our group. Soon after that siyum, the world turned virtual and we never saw Monica in person again, just over the Zoom screen. Week after week, Monica joined our group. We admired that Monica chose to be part of a group with folks she didn't know and a topic she was just beginning to learn. Monica's friend Andrew reached out to let us know that Monica was dying. He shared that even with her camera off, she found comfort in the words and discussion surrounding the daf. May we all be brave and fearless in our learning, and may memories of Monica be a blessing for all. Today's daf is also sponsored by Emma Rimberg in loving memory of her mother-in-law, Phyllis Rimberg, Fruma Sarah, Bat, Reb Aaron, and Mira on the occasion of her 50th yahrzeit, which will take place tomorrow. Phyllis died far too young at age 45, and I was not privileged to know her. She was a talented teacher, head teacher, and lecturer in education. She was creative, loved gardening and sewing. She would, I'm sure, be so proud of her son, my husband, and our family. She would certainly have appreciated the idea of us all learning Daf Yomi together, as education was very important to her. May her memory be blessed. Our learning be Loy Nishmat, all of them. And I would like to also just remind everyone that the registration for the siyum is up. We'll be having siyums around the country in Israel, in Hebrew, and also in our regular Zoom, which will take place on November 14th. That will take place. That will be an all Zoom siyum on Sunday at 8 p.m. Israel time. So again, whatever time it is where you are. And we hope you will all join us. Please register. It's on the homepage of our site right at the top. You can find it. And we will see you there. Okay, that's in a little over a week. So now we're getting into really deep into the shofar sugyot. Okay, all different details about the shofar. We started yesterday with the shofar of Rosh Hashanah. Remember, there was a debate. Is it made from a Yael Pashut? Is it straight from an ibex, or is it kafuf from a ram? Right, we all know it's kafuf. It's bent from a ram. Upiv mitzupeh zahav. I want to go through the beginning of the mission. The Tanakama says the opening of it is covered with gold. Ushte chatzotzrot min hatzedim. They seem to be describing a ceremony that happened in the temple. It doesn't say this explicitly, but we're going to see that this is going to appear later in the Gemara today, that this is really only in the temple. So then they would blow the shofar. Alongside the shofar, they would blow two trumpets. The shofar blower would be in the middle, the two trumpet blowers on the side. Shofar ma'arich v'chatzotzrot mekatzkot. The shofar sound would be longer. The trumpets would be shorter. We're going to see today that it's clear they blew them all at the same time. And that's going to be a big question in the Gemara. How did they blow them all at the same time? You don't really hear any sound if you hear this big mush of sounds. Shemitzvat hayom b'shofar. Because why does the shofar go longer? Because the mitzvah of the day is with the shofar. So now we're going to start with the first part. Piv mitzupeh zahav. The peh is covered with gold. Okay, I'll pull up the picture right now. My mouse isn't working. I don't know why. Okay. Piv mitzupeh zahav. Hopefully I'll get it working and I'll pull up the picture. Okay, so now we have the front of it that is covered with gold. Show you. Let me just pull up. Sorry, this is really not working. Do this without my regular mouse. Okay, so let's go to the first picture. So we have here, you see the pet is covered with gold here. That's our picture. Now we have a braita that seems to contradict. Vahatanya, the braita says, Sipau zahav bimkom alachat piv pasul. Now that looks exactly opposite the picture. If you cover it with gold, in the place where you put your mouth, that's right here in the peh, right? It's disqualified. Shalobim komanachat piv kasher. But if you put the gold not right where you put your mouth, it's okay. So how do we resolve this contradiction? One way to resolve the contradiction is to simply say, there's a Mishnah and there's a Braita, and they contradict each other, and there were two different opinions about whether you can make this part gold or not. But Amar Abaye, right? I think the issue is here that your mouth the gold is going to get in the way of where your mouth is. It's almost like a chatzitza between you and, right, a separation between you and the shofar. So Amar Abaye, don't worry, these actually work together. Why? Kitzan nami matnitin shelobim komadchat petnan. When the Mishnah was saying this, the Mishnah was talking about not where you put your mouth, okay, in a different place. Where exactly that means then, it does say piv mitzupeh zahav. So it's a little bit tricky. What is piv mitzupah? Maybe it means outside on the area, not where your mouth is. It's a little bit tricky, a little bit hard to understand what the Gemara is saying here. Next section. So now there's this concept that if you have two voices at the same time, two things making sounds at the same time, you can't properly hear them. This comes up in halacha in different areas. Like, for example, when you sing during Kiddush, some people say, right, kivanu v'charta, people like to sing during Kiddush. Some people say you can't do that because you're being someone, which is the person saying Kiddush at the table, is basically fulfilling the obligation for everybody. And when you all sing, you can't hear the person who's making Kiddush. So some people are careful to say, oh, you shouldn't do that, right? Some people say that's what we're talking about here, that you can't hear two voices at the same time. So I'm not saying that you can't do it. I'm just saying there's different opinions about it, and some of it is based on this. So the Gemara says, but can you hear two things at the same time? And as if the shofar is going, at the same time that you hear the trumpets blowing, you can't really clearly hear the shofar. And this is a good question, right? The thing that comes to mind immediately is symphonies, right? You hear this conglomeration of all different kinds of music. Some people hear, oh, did you hear the way the oboe sounded? Or did you hear the way, right? Some people are very good at that. Some people, just hear it as one big sound. They can't really identify different sounds. So here they're going to say, can you really hear two sounds? Doesn't it say in a Braita? This is very famous. We'll say this in our davening tonight, which is when the 10 commandments were given, right? In one place it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Shabbat. In another place it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. And the tradition is that God said them both at the same time. And it was miraculous because you can't possibly say two different words at the same time. No human can do that. And people generally can't hear two different sounds at the same time. So they say, we have an answer to that question. That's exactly why. And let's before we get to the answer, let's talk about the question. The question is, if generally you can't hear two things at the same time, how could we possibly have the shofar going at the same time as the chatzatzot? You won't be able to hear the shofar, and it's a problem. You won't be yotze. So they say that's exactly why in the Mishnah it said ma'arich b'shofar. You start blowing, the trumpets blow, the trumpet blowers, the shofar blower, and the shofar goes longer. And so you're yotze when you hear the shofar by itself. Gemara jumps and says, wait, that's a big problem. Because why? L'meimer, are you trying to say the chishama sof tkiya below tchilat tkiya yatsa? Are you trying to say that if you hear the beginning, or you hear the end and not the beginning, you only hear half the shofar blow, you're yotze, you can fulfill your obligation. And then if you say you can hear the end without the beginning, presumably you can hear the beginning without the end. That's the next line. Umimela, and then one can infer tchilat tkiya below sof tkiya yatsa. If you hear the beginning and you don't hear the end, you'll also fulfill your obligation. That's very strange. Why? We're going to bring up two sources that seem to contradict this. This sugya, by the way, is going to appear word for word also in tomorrow's daf. So now the Gemara says, the first question, it's a little bit hard to understand the connection. They're not exactly the same case, and that's exactly what the Gemara is going to say. But in the beginning, they're going to at least think it's similar. So the idea here is that right now, we're assuming you can't hear two voices, in which case, two sounds at the same time. In which case, when you blow the shofar in the chatzatzot, you're basically going to be fulfilling your obligation of shofar when you hear the end, the part of the shofar that extends beyond the trumpets, which means you can hear half a shofar blow without the whole, and it's fine. So Tashma, first source that seems to contradict. Remember, when you blow the shofar, it's tkiya, trua, tkiya, or tkiya, shvarim, tkiya, right? And then you do your next set, tkiya, shvarim, tkiya. So whatever it is, right? Whatever is in the middle, that doesn't interest us right now. We're talking about the tkiyot. So Tashma, let's learn from this source. Taka barishona. So the first of the tkiya in your first set. And then, you blew the first one, you did whatever was in the middle. Umashach b'shniya k'shayim. When you did your end tkiya, which also leads into the next tkiya of the second set, you basically did a very long one. It was as long as two shofar blows. Ein biyado ela achat. You only fulfill, if you do a very long tkiya, you have a shofar blower who is really good and they keep that tkiya for a very long time and it's double the size of what its tkiya needs to be, the length of what its tkiya needs to be, you basically don't fulfill two shofar blasts. It's one. To which the Gemara says, Amai, tisalik le betarte. If we view half a blow, this is where the a little tricky to understand the connection, but they're saying if you could be yotze with half a blow, then theoretically this one very long blow should be able to divide in two. Okay. I think what they're saying is if when you did it with the chatzotzra and then the shofar, we basically look at it as if it's split, right? You did the shofar with the chatzotzra first and then on its own. So we split that almost in half. So we should be able to split this one in half. It's kind of what they're saying. To which the Gemara says, no, these aren't really comparable. And that's why we really don't have a question for you, because psuke tikiyata me'adade la paskina. If they're not split, we don't split them. In other words, one blast without a break in the middle is one blast. It doesn't matter how long it is. There's no such thing as one long blast could count as two. We just don't do that. And therefore, this isn't a question. However, the second question is going to be a question. We're going to have to rethink what we said before. Tashman, this is the next Mishnah. Hatokeh letocha bo, o letocha dut, o letocha pitas. If you blow a shofar inside a pit or inside a cistern, what's the difference? Some people say the difference is that a pit is underground and a cistern is above ground. Some people say the pit doesn't have water, the cistern does have water. The pitas is a barrel. Okay. Now, and some people say some of the differences is that you would never stand in a barrel. You must be outside the barrel with the shofar inside. The bore is you're actually inside the bore. There's a difference of opinion about this, but why would you ever blow a shofar inside a bore? It sounds like a ridiculous case. And theoretically, it could just be a random case. And the Gemara is just trying to get to some halachot, which we're going to learn. But some people say that the issue is, I see you're asking about a microphone. I think it would be the same as the bore, which you'll see in a minute, which is that the issue is a bore, the people went in the times when the Romans wouldn't allow the people to blow the shofar, they would go into pits and blow it there so that no one would hear. So it's possible this was actually a very realistic case. Possible. Not so sure. Wait till you see tomorrow, someone's blowing half in the bore and half the shofar blast is outside the bore. It's a little bit strange to imagine this would really happen. In one case, you'll see the ears are above ground while the shofar's still in the ground. Some interesting cases, but it sounds a little bit less theoretical. But Rav Hai Gaon actually claims that this was a realistic situation. So it says here, if you blow in the bore or the tochadut or the tochapitas, im kol shofar yashama yatsa. If you hear the blast of the shofar directly, then yatsa. This is why I think a microphone would not be okay, because it's indirect. V'im, it sort of depends how you understand a microphone. Im kol havara shama lo yatsa. But if you hear an echo, right, what happens is the sound bounces off the wall. And what you hear is not the direct sound, but the sound coming from the echo of your the sound. That's no good. So it depends how you hear the sound. So now the Gemara says, Amai, but why? According to what you said, you can be yotze with half a shofar blast. If that's the case, right? You can fulfill your obligation, half a shofar blast. If that's the case. Amai, how do sound waves work? First, the sound comes out directly from the shofar. You're going to hear it first direct. Then the waves are going to bounce off the wall and you're going to hear the echo of it. But the beginning of the sound you're going to hear. So if what we assumed before, if you can hear the end of it, you can be yotze, then you can also just hear the beginning of it and fulfill your obligations. So it doesn't make any sense to say, right, that this wouldn't work. Ella, so the Gemara rereads what we thought before. It's not that you can't hear both sounds, and that's why we extend the shofar blast so that you can hear it by itself. No, because then it wouldn't work because you're only half a blow, and half a blast shouldn't work. Ella, tarte kale michad gavra lo mishtame. The source that said you can't hear two things being said by the same person at once was said by the same person. That's impossible to hear. It's impossible for them to say, but it would also, if theoretically someone could do it, it would be impossible for you to hear. But mitre gavre mishtame. But if it's from two separate people, like at a symphony, right? Going back to that example, you hear the trumpets and you hear the oboe playing and you hear the cello and they're all different sounds. So you could theoretically distinguish, right? I was thinking, I always have a hard time if there's two conversations going on, right? Imagine sometimes you're talking and this person starts talking to that person and then the other person crosses and you can't really hear any one of them, right? It's hard. But theoretically, if it's really two different sounds, then you can distinguish them and you could really actually hear. So that's what the Gemara assumes right now. You could hear it if it's from two different people, which, by the way, then my whole Kiddush thing wouldn't be relevant. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. So now you're going to assume that mitrei gavre mishtame, right? You could hear. So the Gemara says, mitrei gavre mi mishtame. But no, we know from another source that you actually can't hear two sounds from two different people. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? B'Torah echad koreh ve'echad metargem. This is the way they used to read from the Torah. In some places, maybe in all places, I don't know. Teimanim still do this today. They read the Torah, they read a pasuk, and then they read the Targum, okay, which is the Targum Onkelos, the translation. Made more sense in the days when everyone understood the Targum Onkelos, which was in Aramaic. Right nowadays, it's much less comprehensible, but they still do it out of tradition. So one person reads and one person reads the commentary. Ubilvad, now here's a little bit of a change in the text. I'm going by the Hagahot on the side of the page. Ubilvad shelo yehe echad koreh ushnayim metargimim. But you can't have one person read and two people at the same time reading the Targum because people won't be able to hear it. So here you see two different people. You can't hear it. Now, I want to point out a big difference, and they don't address this difference in the Gemara, which is before we're talking about shofar and trumpet, two different sounds. Here we're talking about two different people with the same sound. They're both saying the Targum. Now, maybe their voices are different and the sound of their voices are different, but they're actually saying the exact same thing. So it's not exactly the same. You would think actually you would hear better because you're listening. It's one thing. They're actually saying the same thing. It's easier to hear two people when they're saying the same thing, and yet it says no. So maybe that's why. Well, the more so if they're saying different things, it would be a problem. So then the Gemara says, no. You can't quote half a Braita. Halo damya ela l'seifa. Our case of shofar is more similar to the latter case in that text. What did it say there? Behalel ubemigillah yafer in Rosh Chodesh today, right? When they would recite Hallel, or when someone would read Megillah, like Megillah Esther, afilu asara korim, even if 10 people are reading it, you could fulfill your obligation. So they distinguish in this Braita between the Targum on the Torah and Megillah and Hallel. Now, what's the difference? And why would shofar be more similar to Hallel and Megillah? Alma kevan de chaviv yahiv dat. This really goes back to the symphony. If you really, or a conversation you're having with two different people, right? There's two conversations going on and you try to listen to one and not the other. If you really want to hear it, you can hear it. If you don't really want to hear it, or you're not so excited about it, then it'll just be hard to hear. But if you really want to hear something, you'll pay attention even if you have many voices going on, which might explain Kiddush, right? You enjoy singing a Kiddush, so maybe it doesn't matter. You'll still be able to hear. So Kevan de Chaviv. Now, why is it Chaviv? Hallel and Megillah and Targum isn't. So Rashi says, what does it mean Chaviv? De Chadashahilo. Rashi says it's new. This is something that doesn't happen all the time. So it has more excitement associated with it. The Targum we read every week. That already becomes a little bit boring, right? You're used to it. It's not so exciting. But when it comes to Hallel and Megillah, it's something more exciting. Shofar would be the same. And therefore, Hachanami, that we would say the same thing. Kevan de Chaviv, because it's exciting, Yahiv Da'ateh v'shama. You would pay attention and hear, and therefore you can hear the shofar while it's going with the trumpets. So we finished the sugya. We can almost stop here. There's one thing left to explain, which is the whole point in the beginning was we had the shofar blast going longer because you couldn't hear it with the trumpets. According to this, you don't need that. But our answer anyway was already in the Mishnah, if you remember. Lama merich b'shofar. It said in the Mishnah, shemitzvat hayom b'shofar, and that's exactly what the Gemara explains. Leidah shemitzvat hayom b'shofar. They want you to know that shofar is the main mitzvah, and that's why the shofar goes longer. Not because you wouldn't hear it otherwise, but because of that, so you could actually hear it together. Now we see the contrast in the Mishnah. This is a quote from our Mishnah. On fast days, we use the male, meaning the ram that's bent, and it's covered with silver and not gold. So mashna hatam d'zahav, umashna hadikesef. The obvious question: why on Rosh Hashanah is it gold, and on fast days it's silver? So two possible answers: ibait ema kol kinufya dikesefu. Anytime people gather, you use trumpets made of silver, and we'll see it's trumpets, but and then it would be the shofar here too. It says in the Torah, when you want to gather the people, you blow the trumpets for all sorts of reasons. It talks about it in Sefer Bamidbar. It says you blow the trumpets, right, to gather the people. You blow them when there's an enemy up against you, all different situations. And when we do it on the fast days, it's to get all the people to come together. So therefore, there the Chatzotzrot, it says in the Torah, Kesef. For this reason, we would also have Kesef. Whereas Rosh Hashanah, it's totally different. Other people say it's that the Torah didn't want people to have to spend too much money. This comes up a lot when it comes to the temple. On the one hand, there's many things made of gold in the temple. On the other hand, there's sometimes where this thing kicks in, which says, oh no, but they didn't do it that way because they were worried about having the people spend too much money. So therefore, they say, use a shofar that's silver, not gold for the fast days. Why? Obviously, then on Rosh Hashanah, do you need gold? So they say, why don't you also make it gold for shofar? Right? Again, it's always a balancing game. Is it an issue of, right? How fancy do you want you to make things? Right? We all know, I mean, you have to go spend money on the Arba Minim, on Sukkot, and you have to buy a sukkah. And, it's not exactly like the Torah is always concerned with your financial means, right? It's kind of expensive to do mitzvot, all sorts of mitzvot, but there's always a balance. Okay. So when it's called Yom Tov, we want you to spend a little more. When it's not, you could spend less. He wanted in Babylonia to start blowing shofar and chatzotzot together. She said, what are you doing? This is only a law for the mikdash, for the temple. Remember, it didn't say so in the Mishnah, so you can see why he might have thought. Tanya namihachi, but there's a braita to support this explanation. This was all said only in the temple. But outside the temple, makom sheyesh chatzotzot ein shofar. Makom sheyesh shofar ein chatzotzot. On fast days, we use chatzotzot. There's no shofar. On Rosh Hashanah, we use a shofar. There's no chatzotzot. So outside the temple, this is even in the time of the temple. If they ever did any of these things outside the temple, it would always be just one. Okay, you would never do both. This is what they did in these places. They wanted to blow the shofar and the chatzotzot. And but when the rabbis heard that they wanted to do both the shofar and the chatzotzot, they said to them, only do this in the eastern gates and in the Har HaBayit. Rashi says, I think it's Rashi, Chadamil Tehi. What it means is, at least one explanation in Rashi is the eastern gates in the Har HaBayit, not both, but in the Temple Mount, in the eastern gates. Where do we get this? How do we know? In other words, it doesn't say, where is there a reference in the Torah, or really they mean in the Tanakh, to the fact that we only do the combination in the temple? Tichtiv, another connection to our davening tonight. With trumpets and shofar, we blow, this we say in Kabbalat Shabbat, before the king, our God. What's Lifnei Melech Hashem? Before God. That would be in the temple. Lifnei Melech Hashem, hu debina chatzotzot kol shofar. Aval ba'alma lo, but not in general, only before God. Last line in the Mishnah that we're going to deal with is Shaveh Hayovel l'Rosh Hashanah l'Tkiyahu l'Brachot. If you remember, Tanakama said Yovel and Rosh Hashanah have the same, both for Tkiyot, okay, that we got. Now we're going to deal with this bracha. Bracha means Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. You would say the same Musaf on Yom Kippur in the Jubilee year. So we're going to bring in another source and we're going to compare it, but there's going to be two versions of how the sugya went. We're going to see this a few times in today's daf. So here's the first version. In reaction to the Mishnah, this is not a reaction to our Mishnah. First, we're just going to have a statement. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak. Kiman matzlinan ha'idna ze hayom tchilat ma'asecha. In our tefillah on Rosh Hashanah and Musaf, we say, this is the day, right? The first day of ma'asecha, the day you created humans. So, according to, does that go? This goes back to the beginning of our Masechet. Remember the famous machloket, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. When was the world created? And this is why we always think it must have been created a Chaba Tishrei, because our davening matches that. So who does that match? Kiman ki Rabbi Eliezer, who says, B'tishrei nivra olam ta'ama, right? B'tishrei nivra olam, in Tishrei the world was created. There you have it. Our davening must match it. Okay, that's disconnected right now to our topic, but now we're going to connect. Mativ Rav Eina. According to the first version, Rav Eina comes along and says, but wait a minute, I'm going to question that from this Mishnah. It says in our Mishnah, Shaveh Yovel Rosh Hashanah l'Tkiyahu l'Vrachot, v'ha'ika zeh hayom tchilat ma'asecha zikaron liyom rishon. Right? It's the reminder of the first day when the world was created. You can only say this about Rosh Hashanah. You can't say this about Yovel. So if this is part of our davening and our davening matches Rabbi Eliezer, then it doesn't make any sense that our Mishnah must be holding like Rabbi Yoshua, that we don't have Zayom Tchilat Masech in the davening because it wasn't the first day of creation. It was really in Nisan, and therefore our davening doesn't say that line, in which case we could see why the davening would be exactly identical when it comes to the Yovel year, because there's nothing in the davening that would be, a contradiction of sorts. So the Gemara says, that's not a contradiction. Ki katane, and as you could still say our Mishnah holds like Rabbi Eliezer, and they did say Zayom Tchilat Masech in the davening, but ki katane ash'ara, when it said it's the same for brachot, it meant that you say Malchiot Zichronot and Shofarot, but you change that one line. You get rid of that line because that line is obviously irrelevant for Yom Kippur because it's not the first day of creation. Okay, again, the first day of creation, there's different opinions. Is it, right, is Aleph the first day of creation, or is it the sixth day of creation when humans were created? That was the first way to read the sugya. The second way of reading the sugya, okay, the conclusion in the end is the same both ways, but it's different what they start with. Rav Shisha Bered Rav Idi Mat Nehacha. He had a different version. The Amar of Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, okay, he didn't say in the first version, Kimam Matzlin Eden, according to the we daven nowadays. He said, Haditnan, our Mishnah, where it says, Shaveh HaYovel Rosh Hashanah L'Tkiyahu L'Brachot, Kiman Delo Rabbi Eliezer, must not be according to Rabbi Eliezer, right, which was the second stage of the first version. Here it's the first stage. It's to say, our Mishnah must not match Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, because if it was Rabbi Eliezer, then in our davening would be this line that we know is in our davening. It must be if our Mishnah is saying that the davening was exactly the same, then it can't possibly have Zayom Tchilat Masech, in which case it must hold that the creation of the world was in Nisan. To which the Gemara says again, Ki katane ash'ara. No, when it said it's the same for brachot, it was just talking about the rest of davening. It didn't mean that one line. That one line they just get rid of in the Yovel year, and therefore theoretically our Mishnah could match Rabbi Eliezer that the world was created on the first of Tishrei. New Mishnah. Shofar shenistak v'dibko. We're now going to have all different kinds of broken shofarot. If you ever go to one of these shofar factories, that would be a good visit for us to go and see all these things. Shofar, but right now we'll suffice with pictures. Okay, I'll share the screen, put up pictures. Okay. So by the way, here's some pictures that we skipped. 43 is the dut, which goes according to the commentary that it's above ground. Here's the barrel. If someone's going to blow into the barrel. Okay, now we're going to talk about shofar shenistak v'divko pasul. If it cracks and you glue it, it's disqualified. Okay, there's a debate about what it means cracked. So if you see this picture 45 shows it totally split in two, and you want to glue it back together. Some people think that and then basically what's the problem? It's basically two shofarot. And you have to remember there's shofar echad and not multiple shofarot. That's one thing. I think that comes up in tomorrow's stuff. Actually, I started to say yesterday, but I think it's in tomorrow, if I remember correctly. I already recorded it, so I was a little confused. Next, dibek shivrei shofarot pasul. Oh, so what I want to say is Rashi says, it's just cracked. Okay, there's a big crack going the whole length of the shofar, but not that it actually split into two, like Tosfot says. Dibek shivrei shofarot pasul. Okay, this is like when you go to one of these places and they have these broken vessels that they glued together. So here's, by the way, here's the Rashi where it's just the sedek. 46 is the crack all along the whole length of it. 47 is where it's cracked in all different places and they glued the whole thing together. So none of those are good. Nikev ustamo. What if it has, okay, we'll see this in actually a later picture. Just going down here. Picture 55, okay, because the Gemara is going to get into this, so it appears later here. Nikev ustamo. It had a hole and you filled it in with something. Okay, we'll see later that maybe it depends what you fill it in with. If it means the tkiya is not going to come out right, then it's a problem. But if not, it's okay. The Yerushalmi actually says, and it's very interesting, the Yerushalmi says that if it has a hole and the sound is different, right? We all know from musical instruments that if there's a hole, the sound's not going to sound the same. If you didn't fill in the hole, it's actually, according to the Yerushalmi, it's not a problem, even if the sound comes out different. Because we'll see later in today's daf It doesn't matter how the sound comes out. It could sound like a horse sound. It could sound, horse like HOARS, right? Like a horse voice. It could sound a little hoarse. It could sound a little different. That's all okay. So if it has a hole and you blow it and it comes out sounding a little different, that's totally fine. Here, what they mean is because you filled in the hole with something else, that might affect the sound. And that's already something external. That would be more of a problem. It doesn't seem that way from the Bavli, but the Yerushalmi says that. Because they say here, Nikev Ustamo, it doesn't say you just have a hole. Say it just says you have a hole and you filled it in. Then it could be a problem. That's what we saw before already. Depends whether you heard the shofar directly or you heard it indirectly bouncing off the walls, you heard the echo, that would be a problem. This is a very famous sugya. Someone is walking. You happen to pass by a shul. Or you happen to live right next door to the shul. You hear the shofar blast or you hear the Megillah being read. If you paid attention, and now we're going to have to understand what kiven libo is. It sounds like it's saying, if you say, oh, I want to fulfill my mitzvah of shofar, then great, or Megillah. But if you don't, then you're not. Now, this is going to imply that mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. This is a very famous sugya. We talked about it in Pesach. Talk about it again. We're even going to compare it to a case in Pesachim about eating matzah. And this is going to come up all in tomorrow's daf. Very famous discussion about do mitzvot need intent or not. And that's going to come out of this line. It really depends what you mean when you say im kiven libo. What were you intending? Okay, v'im lav lo yatsa. And then af al pi shezeh shama b'zeh shama, even though you heard it and I heard it. You were in shul. I was outside shul. You heard it. I heard it. We heard the same thing, or maybe not. That's going to be part of the discussion tomorrow. You intended and I did not, and therefore there's a difference between the two of us. Also, there's something in the Yerushalmi which is very interesting, which is the Yerushalmi says, you can infer from here, it says, if you were passing by a Beit Knesset. So the Yerushalmi says if you actually stopped and stood, you wouldn't even need intent. That would be enough because your actions show your intent. By stopping, you obviously stopped because you wanted to hear it. So you don't actually need to have intent to be yotze. Just by stopping, that would have been sufficient. And they say, because it says specifically you're passing as if you continually are walking while you're hearing it. But if you were to stop, that would be enough and you wouldn't even need kavanat halev. Now, maybe you'd say that is kavanat halev, right? It's a good question, but it's an interesting, the Yerushalmi has some interesting things that they infer from this Mishnah. Okay, that's all tomorrow's daf. And tomorrow also a very famous sugya of mitzvot, lehenot nitznu, or mitzvot given for benefit. When you do a mitzvah, are you considered having benefited from it or not? That's another interesting sugya that comes up. Tanu Rabbanan, as they use shofar as a good example of a mitzvah for, you could hear something all about your intent. What did you hear, etc. Tanu Rabbanan. So now we're going to bring a slew of braitot that are very similar to our Mishnah. Some overlap with some, the cases overlap. Some cases overlap with each other. Okay, so we'll see a lot of repetition here, which makes it a little easier. And we'll see some new cases. So we're going to go back to the pictures. Let's see, we're up to this one. Okay, not yet, but we'll get there in a minute. Tanu Rabbanan, aroch v'kitzro kasher. If you had a very long shofar and you cut it, it's still fine. Again, we'll see later that there's a certain amount your shofar has to be, a certain length. We'll talk about that soon. Girdo v'hemido al gildo kasher. Now the shofar is thick. You can see from picture 48, there's a yellow circle at the top around this part. This is before they shaved it down. And here they shave down the outside, okay, in the bottom part of the picture. If they shaved it down and it still though has, some thickness to it, it's kasher. Sipau zahav, okay, if you cover it with gold. So again, we go back to im b'mkom anachat peh pasuk, not where you put your mouth. That's disqualified. Shelo b'mkom anachat peh kasher, not where you put your mouth, then it's kasher. Sipau zahav mi bifnim. Pasul mi bachutz im nishtalek hono mikomot shaya pasul im lav kasher. So if you cover it with gold on the inside, that's going to change the way it sounds. That's no good. That's this picture 49. If you go to picture 50, that's mi bachutz. On the outside, it's all gold. Then it really depends. Only if it affects the sound is that a problem. If it doesn't affect the sound, it's okay. Nikev ustamo, this we saw already. Right? If when you fill in the hole, it changes the sound, it's a problem. If not, it's okay. Natan shofar betoch shofar. Picture 51, okay? You put one shofar inside the other. Im kol pnimi shama yatsa. If you really blow through the inner one, then basically it's like you're blowing through a shofar. It doesn't really matter that there's an outer one. Therefore, you're yotze. But if you hear the sound from the outer shofar, which then means you're hearing the sound as it goes, right? There's a barrier between it and the inner shofar, and the sound's coming out sounding different. That's no good. Tano Rabbanit. Girdo bein mibifnim bein mibachutz kasher. When we shave it down, you could shave it down from the inside, you could shave it down from the outside. It doesn't matter. As long as you still have some shofar there, it's fine. That's right. The girdo mido al gildo kasher. If it still has, it's a layer. It's still good. Hiniach shofar b'toch shofar. Same thing we just saw. Right, did I just go back by accident, or it's repetition, right? Yeah, it's the same thing. It's just another brighter with the same thing. Im kol pnimi shama yatsa. Vim kol chitzon shama lo yatsa. It all depends which sound you heard. Repetition. Okay, here we get to a new case in this brighter. Hafacho v'takabo. Okay, you flipped it. How do you do that? Well, you obviously melt it and turn the inside to the outside and make the inside part the outside part and the outside part the inside. Lo yatsa. That's no good. So Amar Papa, he says, no, you misunderstood the case. Lo tema da hafle kikitona. No, it doesn't mean that you flipped it like we just described and you put the outside and the inside. What it meant was you took the wide part. Okay, here's the picture 53. You took the narrow part on the right side here and you widened it. And you took the wider part and you narrowed it. And you want to now blow from the other side. Again, you had to do that by melting it, obviously. So my time, why is that no good? As Rav Matna says, this is when it talks about the shofar in the Yovel year. It says v'ha'avarta shofar. So what is ha'avarta? Derech, right, means you should pass it. Derech ha'ba'arato b'inan. It's the way that it passes, really meaning the way it grows. In other words, it grows on the animal, right? And you're supposed to have it in the same form that it was. You're not supposed to change it. Dibek shivrei shofarot pasul. Quote from the Mishnah. Okay, now we're talking about the broken pieces. So now the Gemara is going to talk about other cases like this. Tanu Rabbanan, again, bringing brightot. It's just like I said today. It's just a lot of brightot. Hosif alav kolshu bein b'mino bein shalo b'mino pasul. If you add something onto the shofar, here you see in picture 54, they add a piece at the end. Whether it's the same type of shofar or it's something other material, it's a problem. Nikev ustamo, but if it had a hole and you blocked it up, now we're going to see something a little different. Bein bimino, this is a little different than what we saw before. Before we saw Nikev ustamo, it was ima kevatat kia pasulim lav kasher. Now, there's a big debate. We're going to see there's a debate between two Tanaim here. It's not clear how the Mishnah works in with this, whether the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Natan or the Mishnah is according to Tanakama. I'm not going to go into all the options, but I'll just tell you that how this fits together with our Mishnah is a good question, because each is talking about different elements. This is talking about what did you fill the hole with? That was talking about, is the sound now different now that you blocked it up? So it could be you blocked it up with a different material and made the sound different, or you blocked it up even with the same material. It would be a problem. Again, really, there's different ways of reading this. I'm not going to go into it all right now. So the Braita says, Tanakama and the Braita says, Bein b'mino, bein shelo b'mino pasul. It doesn't matter if you fixed it up with the same material or a different material. Obviously, a different material is worse. Even with the same material, it's no good, right? And again, this is how does he work in with? It depends really whether it affects the sound or not. So maybe the Mishnah didn't agree with Tanakama. That's possible because Tanakama sounds like it's going to always be disqualified. Rabbi Natan omer b'mino kasher shelo b'mino pasul. Rabbi Natan says if it's the same type like this picture, you fill it in with the same type of material, then it's fine. It's only if it's a different material, it's a problem. Bimino kasher. Now on that line, and we're going to have again two versions of Rabbi Yochanan's statement. This is the first one. If it's the same type, it's kasher. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'hu shenishtayeh rubo. That's as long as, like in this picture, the majority of the shofar is still intact. But if it's not still intact, even if you fill it in with the same material, and you don't have the majority of the shofar, and you have to fill in the majority of it, it's no good. But what can you infer from here, though? From Rabbi Yochanan's statement, Michlal de shelo b'mino, that if you fill it in with a different material, afilu nisheya rubo pasul, even if you have most of the shofar in this little hole and you fill it in with some other substance, clearly Rabbi Natan's going to think it's no good, according to Rabbi Yochanan's reading. However, some people say that Rabbi Yochanan's statement was made on this last line. When it says shelo b'mino pasul, Amal Rabbi Yochanan v'hu shenifchat lubo. It's only going to be disqualified if the majority of it was cracked, was gone. Okay, right? Like let's say there's a huge hole in it and you're left with less than the majority and you fill it in with some other material, it's no good. But what would you infer from there then? Michlal de bimino, if it's its own type, you fill it in with, even if you lost most of the shofar, it would still be okay. So depending on which part of that of Rabbi Natan's statement, Rabbi Yochanan made his statement, it would affect the halacha, right, greatly. If you cover it with gold on the inside, it's disqualified. Again, we're in the middle of a braita. We kind of stopped for a minute to get into Rabbi Yochanan's statement on this. Now we're back to the braita. If you fill it with gold, again, we're repeating because this is just another braita. If you cover it with gold from the inside, it's disqualified. Mi bachutz, if it's on the outside, it all depends. This is just like we saw in our Mishnah. Im nishtane kolo, or I think it was a braita. Im nishtane kolo mikamot shaya pasu. If it changes it, it's disqualified. V'im lav pasher, and if not, it's okay. Nistak leorko, again, we're still in this braita now. If it's cut, if it has a crack according to the length of it, it's disqualified. Lirochbo, but if let's say you cut, right, it got cut in the middle, okay, meaning widthwise, right? So you basically have half the shofar left, or we don't know how much of it left. We'll talk about that in a minute. Im nishtayer bo shiur tzkiah, we finally get to the shiur of a shofar. If it has the shiur of a shofar, even though it says shiur tzkiah, it doesn't mean the shiur of the tzkiah itself. It means the shiur of the shofar, kasher, pim lav pasu. That sounds great, but what on earth is the shiur of a tzkiah? V'kama shiur tzkiah, peresh rashbag, kedei sheyochzenu biyado v'yira'eh lekan u'lekan. Here's our picture. You hold it in your hand, and you can see the shofar on either side. If you can't see the shofar, it's no good. Why is that? It's actually very logical. People do a cappello now, right? And all these things, lots of people are really talented, not me, but they can make all sorts of sounds with their mouth, right? Put something in front of their mouth and make all sorts of great sound. So if you do that and no one can see the shofar and you just have your hand there and the shofar's not sticking out on either side, people are going to think you're making the sound yourself. They're not going to realize it's from a shofar. So therefore, it has to be seen on both sides. So if it cracked from by the width of it, and you have enough that you can see the shofar on both sides, which is actually pretty small, then it's okay. It's actually helpful to see the picture to see really how small it is. Hayat kolo, this is what I made reference to before. The sound came out dak, or aveh, thin or thick, o tzarud, or it was hoarse sounding. Kasher, shekola kolo ksherim b'shofar. All sounds are kasher for the shofar. Shalchule lavu adishmuel. They sent to Avu adishmuel, kadcho v'takabo yatsa. Okay, if you drill a hole in it, it's kasher. So the Gemara says, pshita, kulunami midkach kadchelahu. They always do that because there's bone inside. You always have to drill the inside. So Amar Ravashi shekadcho b'zachruto. Ma'u detem amim b'mino chotzetz kamash malan. Okay, so now they say it's that you drilled it. In other words, there's a way you could pull out the bone, or you could actually drill it. So you might have thought that by putting in, that by having, right, this is 1 second. I want to just check something. Right, that in other words, even you might have thought, even though you still have some bone in it, okay, and bone is part of the shofar, has the bone of the animal in it inherently. So you might have thought maybe that creates a barrier, right? Because you drilled into it, but you still have some bone in there. Kamash malan, that it's okay. Hatokea letoch habor o letoch hadut. So Amar Rav Huna lo shanu ela leotan homdim al sfat habor. When you're talking about you're in the bore, it's no good. That's only the people outside the bore, because when you're outside the bore, this is classic, right? Sound. The sound bounces off. You only hear it, the echo of it, when you're outside. Avalotam homdim babor yatsu. But anyone in the bore actually hears the sound of the shofar. It's okay. Tanya namihachi. There's a braita to support this reading. Hatokea letoch habor o letoch hadut yatsa. And there you have the hatznan, but then, right, they say, but the Mishnah says, lo yatsa, ela lav shmamina k'Rav Huna shmamina. The fact that there's one braita that says it's good, one braita that says it's not good, it must be the way Rav Huna answered. Now we're going to read this whole sugya a different way. Okay, again, third time we're doing this today. Instead of Rav Huna making a statement and then bringing this braita that contradicts the Mishnah to say, oh, well, that supports Rav Huna, it started off that Rav Huna brought the contradiction between the Mishnah and the braita. It's the same conclusion. It's just a different way of learning it. Doesn't it say in a Braita, it's okay? The response is, again, it depends whether you're outside or whether you're inside. Tomorrow we'll get into this case much more. Have a great day, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, and we'll meet up on